Margaret Elaine Shaw did not lose everything in a single afternoon. Warren had used exactly 22 months to do it, quietly, methodically, with signatures. When the divorce was finalized, the house on Whitmore Drive was no longer in her name. The investment accounts had been restructured 3 times each, restructuring a little more opaque than the land, each one requiring her signature on documents whose language she understood just well enough to know she was not meant to understand them fully. The joint savings had moved through 4 different legal vehicles before landing somewhere she could not reach. And the 28 years she had spent building a life around his ambition had been assigned a settlement number so small it could not have covered a single year's rent in the city where she had once had a home. What remained was her car, a storage unit she had not yet opened, and the last $18,500 in a checking account that was for the first time in nearly 3 decades only hers. If you have ever watched someone take apart a house, you know that the demolition is not the hard part. The hard part is what happens after. When the dust settles and you are standing in the middle of what used to be a floor looking at the sky, where there used to be a ceiling, and you have to decide whether to walk away or pick up the first board. Margaret Elaine Shaw picked up the first board. But before we get to that, you need to understand who she was before she became the woman standing in the rubble. Because no one arrives at a moment like that empty. They arrive carrying everything they were taught and everything they forgot they were taught, and sometimes the difference between those two things is the difference between staying down and getting up. Margaret had gone into the marriage with a degree she had never fully used, a sense of order that other people called competence, and a grandmother who had told her once, while standing at a stove on a summer evening in Natchez, Mississippi, in the particular heat of late July, that the most dangerous thing a woman could give away was the habit of trusting her own hands. Her grandmother's name was Nell Alma Pritchard. She was not a tall woman. She was not loud. She did not give speeches or write letters to newspapers or make herself known in any of the ways that the world tends to notice. What she did was cook. She cooked the way some people pray, with attention and repetition, and a belief that the act itself mattered more than who was watching. Her kitchen in Natchez smelled in July the way certain places smell only once, and then you carry it with you for the rest of your life. Hot peppers and cane sugar and apple cider vinegar and cloves, and something underneath all of it that Margaret, even as a girl sitting on a high stool watching her grandmother stir a cast iron pot, could never quite name. Nell never explained why she cooked. She just cooked. She would hand Margaret a spoon and say, "Taste this," and Margaret would taste it, and Nell would say, "Not yet," or "That will do," and Margaret understood even then that she was being taught something that had nothing to do with food. She was being taught how to know when something was right, not good enough, not close, right. Margaret was 27 when she married Warren Shaw. He was 31, and he was the kind of man who entered a room and seemed to make it arrange itself around him without raising his voice. She had believed for a very long time that this quality was confidence. It took her most of their marriage to understand that it was something else entirely. It was not confidence. It was the posture of someone who had never once had to account for anything he did. The marriage had not been unhappy for all of it. There were years that were full and real. 2 children born into a house that ran on her judgment, even when his name was on every document. A kitchen where she cooked for every gathering he called business, every dinner he called strategic, every occasion on which the warmth of a well-made meal had smoothed something that his deal-making had roughened. She had not simply been present at the edge of his life. She had been the condition under which that life was possible. The last dinner party she cooked for Warren was on a Saturday evening in October. 14 guests, cloth napkins she had ironed that morning, A roasted pork loin with a fig glaze she had developed herself over 3 separate test runs. Warren moved through the room the way he always did, touching shoulders, refilling glasses, making people feel that they had been personally selected for something important. When he introduced Margaret to a new business partner near the end of the evening, he placed his hand on the small of her back and said, "Margaret keeps everything running smoothly at home." She had heard this sentence or versions of it for 20 years. It had always landed somewhere between compliment and description. But on that particular evening, standing in her own kitchen with flowers still under her fingernails, Margaret heard it the way you hear a sound you have been hearing for so long that you stop noticing it until the moment you suddenly do. And what she heard was this: she had been introduced as a supporting condition, not a person, as the thing that made his life possible, not as someone with a life of her own. A woman she did not know. One of the partner's wives leaned close to her near the dessert table and said quietly, "You are a wonderful cook. Have you ever thought about opening a restaurant?" Margaret smiled and did not answer. The feeling stayed, not as anger, not as revelation, as a step missed in the dark, the sudden awareness of ground that was not where she expected it to be. She did not act on it. She filed it the way you file a receipt you are not sure you will need, but she kept it. 3 months later, she found in Warren's email account a chain of messages that told a story she had not been invited into. The messages were not dramatic. They were not explicit in the way that certain kinds of betrayal announce themselves. They were familiar. They had the tone of two people who had already passed the point of needing to explain themselves to each other, and that familiarity was worse than anything graphic could have been, because it meant this had been going on long enough to become ordinary. She filed for legal separation, and the 22 months that followed had a different character entirely. Warren's lawyer was efficient and thorough. The house was refinanced. A partnership stake in a commercial real estate entity was transferred. A succession of small legal steps, none dramatic enough on its own to feel like a landslide together, moved the ground out from under her without her fully understanding what was happening until she was already standing somewhere different. It was not that Warren was cruel, it was that he was systematic. He approached the dissolution of their marriage the way he approached a commercial acquisition, with a clear objective, a competent team, and no emotional attachment to the process whatsoever. The settlement was final in March. By April, Margaret was sleeping in a short-term rental with 2 suitcases and a box of cookbooks she had not been able to leave behind. She had $18,500 in no particular plan. What she did have was a habit inherited from her grandmother of not standing still, when standing still cost more than moving. Before she found the building, Margaret went to a bank. She had heard that small business renovation loans existed for commercial properties, and she wanted to understand the terms. The loan officer's name was Denise Crowder. She was somewhere in her mid-40s with the professional demeanor of someone who had learned to deliver bad news without flinching and had come to believe, perhaps reasonably, that delivering bad news early was a form of kindness. Denise looked at Margaret's financial profile on her screen for less than 2 minutes. No assets, no steady income, recently divorced, credit history that had been entangled with the spouses for nearly 3 decades and had not yet been separated into anything a bank could evaluate independently. She did not open a file. She did not begin an application. She looked at Margaret across the desk and said, "Mrs. Shaw, the bank does not lend based on intention. You have no collateral, no cash flow, and you have just lost your primary financial structure. I am trying to protect you from a decision you will regret." Margaret looked at her for a moment. "I did not ask you to protect me. I asked about interest rates." Denise shook her head. She was not unkind. She simply had a system for evaluating risk, and Margaret, by every measure that system recognized, was a risk the bank could not take. Margaret thanked her and left. On the drive back to the rental, she pulled over on a side street, 3 blocks from the building she had not yet seen, and sat with the engine running. She did not cry, but her hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and she held them there and watched them shake, and she thought about the fact that Denise Crowder was not wrong. She had no collateral. She had no proof that she was not a woman making a catastrophic decision at the worst possible moment in her life. And she wondered for the first time since the divorce whether everyone Denise Cece even Warren might be right about her. Whether she was about to destroy the last thing she had left. She sat with that thought until it lost its weight. Then she started the engine and drove. Not because she was certain she was right, but because she had run out of places to stand still. The listing for the building on Beaumont Street had been sitting in the county property database for 11 months. It had been a small diner, once the kind of place with a name on a hand-painted sign, a regular clientele of morning people, and a particular smell that those who remembered it carried with them for years after it closed. The closing had not been dramatic. The previous owner had become ill. The lease had run out. The building had simply stopped being used the way buildings do when the people who gave them their purpose are no longer there. 3 prospective buyers had toured it since it went on the market. The first had been deterred by the condition of the ventilation system. The second by the electrical panel. The third had made an offer, had it accepted, and then withdrawn quietly 2 weeks before closing without offering any explanation in writing. Nobody knew why. The listing agent had stopped expecting the phone to ring. Margaret saw the building on a Thursday afternoon alone with the listing agent, who kept glancing at his phone as though he had better places to be. The building was on the eastern edge of Beaumont Street, a block and a half from a church and directly across from a hardware store that had been in the same family for 3 generations. The exterior was faded brick. The front window was intact but clouded. The door was metal and had been painted once a shade of green that had since turned to the color of pond water. She spent 40 minutes inside. She did not ask about the ventilation. She asked about the building's original water line, the load-bearing capacity of the back wall, and whether the county health and food service permits were still active or would need to be refiled from the beginning. The listing agent was surprised enough by the specificity of the questions that he put his phone in his pocket. She made an offer the following morning. It was accepted by the end of the day. $17,000, nearly everything she had. Her daughter Cecilia called that evening. Margaret could hear it in her voice immediately, the lightness that was not exactly lightness, the concern that was not entirely concern. Cece was 32 years old and had inherited from her father the ability to ask questions that were not questions, to express worry in a way that gathered information without appearing to seek it. "Mom, what exactly are you doing?" "I bought a building." "A building with what money?" Margaret let the question sit for a moment before answering. "With mine." There was a pause. Then Cece pressed her voice, softening in a way that was meant to sound gentle but carried a different kind of edge underneath. "Have you talked to anyone about this?" "Not a lawyer, I mean someone with business experience." Margaret understood exactly what her daughter was saying. "Someone other than you, because you are not capable of deciding this on your own." "I will be talking to a plumber, an electrician, and a health inspector," she said. "Those are the people with the experience I need right now." She ended the call, set the phone down on the counter of the rental kitchen, looked at the box of cookbooks, the only thing she had been deliberate about keeping from the house on Whitmore Drive. She opened the one on top. Between pages 47 and 48, she found a slip of paper she did not remember placing there. It was in her grandmother's handwriting, a single line about the ratio of cane vinegar to sugar for the October batch. The handwriting was so familiar that Margaret felt for a moment as though someone had just walked into the room. She closed the book. She did not feel better, but she felt less alone. Margaret had been in the building for 9 days before she opened the door at the back of the main kitchen. It was not a room she had been avoiding exactly. It simply had not been the priority. She had spent the first week measuring floors, assessing plumbing lines, making notes about what could stay and what would need to go entirely. The door had been there each time she passed. It closed but unlocked. She had registered it without stopping. On the 10th morning, she stopped. She stood at the door for a long moment with a flashlight in one hand and a measuring tape clipped to her belt. The light from the kitchen windows behind her did not reach past the threshold. When she pushed the door open, the smell that reached her was not simply old air. It was something denser, something that had settled through years of not being disturbed. Dust and cool concrete, and beneath that something faintly sweet, faintly sharp, the way a kitchen smells, long after the cooking has stopped, but before the memory of it has entirely faded. The room was narrow. 2 broken shelving units leaned against the left wall. A stack of folded plastic crates sat near the corner. A rusted folding table, a cardboard box whose corners had softened and collapsed. Along the back wall, set apart from the rest of the clutter, with a deliberateness that seemed unusual given the general disorder of everything else. There were 4 wooden crates set on a low wooden platform, covered with a heavy canvas cloth tied at the corners with cord. They had not been left carelessly. They had been placed. Margaret crossed the room and untied the cord on the right side. She pulled the canvas back. Glass jars arranged in rows, each row separated by folded cloth padding, each one sealed with a metal lid that had darkened with oxidation but held. She counted them slowly. 31 jars in those 4 crates. The labels were hand-applied paper that had yellowed and dried but had not disintegrated. The ink had faded but was legible. She picked up the jar nearest her left hand. The glass was cold. The contents were dark amber with a deep red undertone, thick and dense, the way something preserves correctly when it has been put up with enough sugar and enough heat and enough time. She brought it close enough to read the label. Magnolia River Pepper Jelly, Nell Alma Pritchard, Natchez, Mississippi. Margaret did not set the jar down. She stood in the middle of that cold, narrow room, holding it, reading the words a second time and then a third, as if they might shift into something other than what they already so plainly were. Her grandmother had been dead for 11 years. Her grandmother's name was on a jar of pepper jelly in the back room of a building she had purchased for $17,000 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in a city she had moved to because she had nowhere else specific to go. She sat down on the edge of one of the wooden crates. She was still holding the jar. She did not put it down for a long time. At some point, she realized that she was crying, and not the kind of crying that makes sound, but the kind where tears fall, and you do not notice until one lands on the glass in your hands. She did not wipe it away. She thought about her grandmother standing at the stove, about the July afternoons when Margaret sat on the high stool and watched Nell stir the pot, about the way Nell never said, "This is for you," or "Remember this." She just handed Margaret the spoon and said, "Taste." And Margaret realized that in 28 years of marriage, no one had ever once asked her what was right, only what was convenient, only what kept things running smoothly. She sat with that until the feeling changed shape. Then she stood up. It took her another 20 minutes to go through the rest. The jars were arranged in layers, each separated by cloth. They were not all the same. Some labels read pepper jelly, some read fig and hot pepper preserve. Some read simply small batch October with a year written beneath. The years spanned more than a decade. Under the fourth layer in the third crate, she found a bundle of papers wrapped in wax cloth and tied with kitchen twine. She carried the bundle out into the main kitchen, where the light from the window above the prep counter was better. She set it down and untied the twine carefully. The wax cloth had done its job. The papers inside were intact. Their edges had softened with age, and a few corners had darkened, but they were legible and whole. There were letters handwritten in two different hands. There were order forms filled out in pencil. There were typed invoices with carbon copies smudging on the second sheets, and at the bottom of the bundle, separated from the rest by a piece of flat cardboard cut from a grocery box, there were documents that were different in character from everything else. They were typed on legal paper. They had been signed and notarized. The name at the top was Nell Alma Pritchard, Natchez, Mississippi. The subject was Production Rights Distribution Agreement and Intellectual Property Registration for a product known commercially as Magnolia River Pepper Jelly, including all associated recipes, formulations, batch preparation methods, and branding elements. She read the date at the top of the document, then she read it again. 1991. Her grandmother had registered this recipe, this brand, and this name 32 years ago. 22 years before Margaret had ever met Warren Shaw. She turned to the final page. Near the bottom in the section that described the disposition of rights in the event of the principal party's death, she found a clause that ran 4 lines. She read it through once without stopping. Then she placed both hands flat on the counter and read those 4 lines again. All rights, entitlements, and legal interests described in this agreement shall pass upon the death of the principals to her direct lineal descendants in order of proximity of relation. Margaret's mother had died 4 years earlier. Nell had only one child. Margaret had no siblings. She was the sole surviving direct lineal descendant of Nell Alma Pritchard. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside on Beaumont Street, a delivery truck ground through a gear change and moved on. Margaret stood at the prep counter with her grandmother's documents under her hands until the light outside the window had shifted enough to tell her that more than an hour had passed without her noticing. She looked down at her hands, dust from the morning's measuring, ink from her notes, a small cut from the canvas cord. Her hands looked the way her grandmother's hands had always looked, marked by work never smooth. The most dangerous thing a woman could give away was the habit of trusting her own hands. Margaret gathered these documents, wrapped them back in the wax cloth, placed them in her canvas tote bag. She looked around the kitchen at the late afternoon light coming through the window, at the dust suspended in the air, at the 31 jars lined up on the counter, where she had placed them one by one as she counted. For the first time since the court had signed the papers, Margaret knew exactly what she needed to do next. And for the first time, that step was not a reaction to something Warren had done. It was entirely her own. She picked up her phone and began searching for an intellectual property attorney in Baton Rouge. Patricia Oldham's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Convention Street, 2 blocks from the river. The elevator was slow, the hallway was narrow and smelled faintly of floor polish and old paper. Margaret arrived with the wax cloth bundle in a canvas tote bag and sat in the waiting area for 12 minutes before the assistant showed her in. Vivian Kincaid was 54 years old with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had the specific professional manner of someone who had spent a career reading documents that people had tried very hard to make confusing and had found again and again that they were not nearly as confusing as intended. She did not make small talk. She did not ask Margaret how she was doing or whether she wanted coffee. She asked Margaret to place the documents on the desk, and then she began to read. She read methodically in order from the letters to the invoices to the legal documents. She did not skim or rush any section. She made 3 short notes in the margin of her legal pad. She turned back twice to earlier pages to confirm something she had seen. When she reached the final document, she read the rights transfer clause twice without expression. Then she removed her reading glasses and set them on the desk. 3 questions. The first, was Margaret the only surviving direct lineal descendant of Nell Alma Pritchard? Yes. Her mother had died 4 years earlier. Nell had only one child. Margaret had no siblings. The second, had the brand or its associated intellectual property ever been transferred, sold, licensed, or commingled with marital assets at any point during the marriage? Margaret said she had not known the brand existed until 9 days ago. Vivian nodded in the manner of someone for whom this was the expected answer. The third, had her former husband's legal team at any point during the divorce proceedings made contact with anyone in connection with this property or the building she had purchased? Margaret said she did not believe so. Not yet, Vivian said. She made a fourth note. She laid the documents back into their original order before speaking again. What I am about to tell you is preliminary. I will need to verify several elements. But based on what I am reading, the rights under this agreement predate your marriage by more than 2 decades. They were not disclosed in the marital estate because neither party knew they existed. Under those circumstances, I do not see a basis for any claim that they constitute shared marital property. She paused. Her eyes moved to the window for a moment, then back to Margaret. However, I want you to be clear about something. The moment this becomes known to the other party, it will be contested. People who are accustomed to winning through paperwork do not stop simply because the paperwork does not support them. They find other angles. What angles? Margaret asked. Vivian looked at her steadily. The argument that discovery of the asset occurred during the post-dissolution period. The argument that you failed to disclose a potential asset during negotiations. Neither will hold up, but they can be used to create delay, cost, and pressure so that you accept a reduced settlement before the hearing ever reaches a substantive ruling. She closed the folder. I am advising you to file the inheritance claim immediately and to have the full value of this brand assessed by a specialist before anyone else has the opportunity to do so first. Margaret picked up her bag. File everything that needs to be filed, she said. Vivian was already reaching for her calendar. On the drive back to Beaumont Street, Margaret thought about something she had not expected to think about. She had spent 28 years trusting one person with everything she had. Now she was trusting another person, a woman she had met 40 minutes ago, with what might be the only asset she had left in the world. She wondered whether she had the ability to tell the difference between trust and the habit of handing things over. Then she remembered that Vivian had not asked her to trust. Vivian had told her to file paperwork. That was a different thing entirely. She decided she would trust the documents, not the people, at least for now. The renovation had begun in the way that all renovations of neglected buildings begin with the discovery that everything was worse than it looked. Ray Fontenot, the contractor she had hired on Reverend Blaine's recommendation, was a quiet man in his mid-50s who wore the same pair of steel-toed boots every day and had a habit of standing in a room for a long time before saying anything about it. He would look at a wall the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, not at what was visible, but at what was behind it. It was Ray who told her the plumbing in the back kitchen would need to be entirely replaced. It was Ray who found the hairline crack in the foundation near the southeast corner that nobody else had noticed. And it was Ray who, when Margaret told him she could not pay the full renovation cost up front and would need to work in phases, nodded once and said he could work with that and meant it. Margaret had learned by this point in her life that there were people who said they could work with difficult circumstances and people who actually could. Ray was the second kind. Reverend Curtis Blaine came to the building on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Margaret had begun the renovation. He was the pastor of a small church at the far end of Beaumont Street, a man of about 70 who had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years and walked its sidewalks with the unhurried pace of someone who considered every block a kind of congregation. He was not tall. He spoke slowly not because he did not know what to say, but because he valued each sentence enough not to waste it. He did not come out of curiosity. He came because the building had a history and he believed that history ought to be passed along. You know, he said, standing in the middle of the gutted dining room with his hands in the pockets of a corduroy jacket that had been mended at the elbow, the old people in this neighborhood used to call this place Nell's Place. Not because she owned it, because her pepper jelly was the reason people came. Margaret set down the tape measure she had been holding. She had not known that her grandmother had ever been to this building. She had not known that anyone in Baton Rouge remembered her. Blaine told her the rest. Nell Alma Pritchard had driven up from Natchez twice a year for more than a decade, delivering jars to Opal Thibodeau, the woman who ran the diner. The October batch, and once more in spring. The neighborhood remembered Nell by the smell that came out of the kitchen those weeks, a smell that people who had moved away still talked about when they came back to visit. "There is a woman named Opal in Prairieville," Blaine said. "She is still alive. You should see her." He also introduced Margaret to 3 local suppliers he trusted. He did not ask what she planned to do with the building. He behaved as though she had belonged to the neighborhood before she arrived. And Margaret realized that this, more than any encouragement or reassurance, was what she needed to hear. Not that she could do it, but that she was already where she was supposed to be. He came in on a Wednesday afternoon, 4 days after Margaret had returned to Vivian's office to sign the filing paperwork. She was at the far end of the main room, working through a punch list with Ray, when the front door swung open and a man she did not know walked in. He was somewhere in his early 50s, wearing a linen shirt the color of pale clay, carrying no briefcase, only his jacket draped over one forearm. He had the bearing of a man who looked comfortable arriving in places that were not yet ready for him without needing to hurry them along. "Mrs. Shaw," he said. She set down her clipboard. "Yes, my name is Dawson Hale." She knew the name. Dawson Hale had started with a single market stall selling handmade hot sauces in Shreveport 14 years ago. He had built Hale's Southern Pantry into a regional brand with distribution in 11 states and a reputation for reviving forgotten Southern food traditions with what critics described as almost unsettling authenticity. He placed a business card on the nearest surface without ceremony. "I heard about the inheritance filing through a contact at the records office. I want to be straightforward with you about why I came." He walked slowly toward the center of the empty room and looked around before continuing. "I have been researching the provenance of Magnolia River Pepper Jelly for the better part of 4 years. I found a reference to it in a 1996 restaurant supply ledger in Natchez. Then I found a menu from a restaurant in Macomb that listed it by name in 1999. I found a note in a food magazine from 2003 describing it as a regional specialty that had quietly disappeared. Every trail I followed ended without finding who held the rights or where the product had gone." He turned to face her. "Until this week." Margaret crossed her arms, not defensively, in the way of someone taking careful stock. "Why have you been looking for it for 4 years?" "Because I have been in this business long enough to know what a real recipe is. Not a formula, not a flavor profile engineered in a test kitchen. A real recipe, one that exists because someone understood something specific about an ingredient and a process that nobody else had articulated. Your grandmother understood something about peppers, fig, and cane vinegar that I have never seen replicated in anything currently on the market." He paused. "I came to find out whether the heir understands the same things." Margaret looked at him for a moment. "I grew up in that kitchen," she said. Dawson Hale nodded once as if a question he had been carrying for 4 years had just been answered in a single sentence. He asked if he could return in 2 days with the documentation his team had compiled. No pressure, he said, no number on the table. He simply wanted her to see what he had found before they discussed anything else. He was at the door when she called after him. One question, she said. What do you think that kitchen smelled like on a July afternoon? He turned back and considered for a moment. Hot peppers and cane sugar and something underneath it that I would guess was apple cider vinegar and cloves. But that is a guess. The underneath part is what I was never able to figure out entirely. Margaret said nothing. He nodded once more and left. The door closed behind him with a small, neat sound. After Dawson was gone, Margaret stood in the middle of the empty room. Ray Fontenot looked at her from across the space and said, "He seems like he knows what he is talking about." "He does," Margaret said, "but he does not know the underneath part." Ray did not ask what the underneath part was. He went back to measuring the waterline. Margaret appreciated that about him. A man who understood when not to ask another question. She was learning slowly and painfully that this quality was rarer and more valuable than she had once believed. The calls from Cecilia had begun the week after Margaret purchased the building. They came every 3 or 4 days, timed with a regularity that appeared casual until you noticed the pattern beneath it. The questions followed a recognizable structure. They began with small, practical concerns. How was the renovation going? Had she hired a contractor? Was the kitchen in compliance with county codes? After the discovery of the jars in the inheritance filing, the questions shifted. More specific. Had the old storage area contained any paperwork? What kind? Had anyone contacted her about the property? Margaret answered each question plainly, giving enough that it did not feel like withholding, but never more than she had decided to share. She had understood the pattern long enough to know what was being done with the answers. It was on the 4th call after the filing that Cece said, almost as a side remark, "Dad mentioned that old properties sometimes come with unresolved ownership issues. You might want to be careful about that." Margaret held the phone. Her daughter had not said anything wrong. She never did. That had always been the most notable quality about her. "I have a lawyer," Margaret said. "Of course. Good." Margaret hung up and forwarded the call log to Vivian's email with a single line attached. "Monitoring these. Let me know if you need them." Vivian replied 12 minutes later with 2 words. "Keep everything." Warren called on a Thursday evening 10 days after the inheritance claim had been filed. Margaret was in the building standing at the prep counter going through tile samples with Ray. She saw the name on the screen, excused herself, stepped through the back door into the small courtyard, and answered on the 4th ring. "It is Frank." "I know," she said. He spoke with measured calm. His voice was low. He did not rush. He used complete sentences. He framed everything in terms of concern for her rather than desire for himself. Margaret had once found this quality reassuring. She now understood precisely what it signaled. The more careful his voice became, the more clearly she could see what he wanted. "I have heard through Claire that you found some papers at the property that might be legally complex." He still used their daughter's middle name when he wanted to suggest normalcy. Margaret leaned against the brick wall of the courtyard. "Cecilia can keep her father informed about her own business, not mine." Warren paused for exactly the length of time that suggested he was choosing to be patient. "I am not asking as a former spouse. I am flagging as someone who understands property law that assets discovered after a divorce is finalized can be subject to supplemental review under certain circumstances." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. The river was somewhere behind her, not visible, but present in the air, a smell of brackish water and warm concrete. "Those circumstances do not apply here. You do not know that yet. My lawyer does." There was a pause, slightly longer than the previous one. If there is a brand involved, he said a historical one with commercial value that may have arisen under conditions that existed during our marriage. It was registered in 1991, Margaret said. Warren went silent. She let the silence hold for 4 seconds. 22 years before we were married. Inherited through my mother's line, documented, filed, and completely outside the terms of any divorce proceeding involving you. She ended the call. She stood in the courtyard until Ray knocked on the back door to ask which tile she preferred. She went back inside and chose the middle shade. 2 weeks later, Margaret returned to the bank. She had the inheritance documentation now and a preliminary brand valuation that Dawson's team had helped prepare. She wanted to try again for the renovation loan. Denise Crowder reviewed the new file. Her expression changed as she read. She looked up at Margaret with what appeared to be genuine surprise. Then she set the file down and said she could not approve the loan. I received a verification call from a party connected to your property. They indicated there is an ownership dispute pending. Margaret's face did not change. She asked who was the call from. I am not able to disclose that. You do not need to disclose it, Margaret said. I already know. She left the bank. She called Vivian from the parking lot. Vivian noted the call as evidence of a pattern of systematic interference. Another piece for the file that was growing thicker each week. The consequence was immediate and concrete. Margaret would have to complete the renovation entirely on existing cash, choosing which repairs to make first and which to defer on, stretching every dollar across decisions that were no longer just practical, but strategic. Ray Fontenot agreed to staggered payments without being asked twice. 3 days later, Vivian called. Her voice was sharper than usual. Someone has filed a challenge to your inheritance claim. Her name was Louise Pritchard Kent. She was 68 years old and claimed to be the granddaughter of Nell's brother, making her a member of a different branch of the Pritchard family. She had retained her own attorney. She appeared at Vivian's office in a formal suit, carrying a leather portfolio, and speaking in a voice that managed to sound both aggrieved and rehearsed at the same time. Ruth, she said, using Nell's first name as though they had been close. Nell was my aunt. I carry the Pritchard blood too. Family is family. Vivian asked for documentation establishing direct lineal descent. Louise produced a birth certificate showing her father was Nell's brother. Vivian examined it for 30 seconds. The transfer clause specifies direct lineal descendants, she said. That means children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. It does not include nieces. Louise turned to Margaret. Her expression shifted, searching for an angle that the documents had not provided. Margaret met her eyes. Did you know how my grandmother made this jelly? She asked. Did you ever stand in that kitchen? Louise did not answer. I stood in that kitchen, Margaret said. I know what it smelled like at 3 p.m. in July. It was not a legal argument. It was something else. It was Margaret establishing that inheritance was not only paper and blood. It was knowledge, memory, and a connection that could not be manufactured in a law office. After Louise left, Vivian closed the door. If Louise is being funded by Warren, and I suspect she is, then this is a second front. Not a genuine claim. They are trying to create enough simultaneous pressure that you exhaust yourself before anything reaches a ruling. Margaret looked at her. How many fronts can he open? As many as he can afford to pay for. The question is how long you can hold. Longer than he thinks, Margaret said. Vivian studied her face for a moment. Then she nodded. Good. The email from Vivian arrived at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. Margaret was at the small table in her rental, coffee in hand, working through a list of kitchen equipment vendors. She opened the email. Subject line: supplemental filing. Review immediately. Warren, through his legal counsel, had filed a petition requesting that the court conduct a supplemental review of assets discovered in the post-dissolution period, specifically the brand registered under the name Magnolia River Pepper Jelly on the grounds that the commercial value of said brand had materially arisen as a result of circumstances occurring during the marital period, and that the failure to disclose a potential inherited interest during the original proceedings constituted grounds for reopening the division of assets. Attached to the petition was a chain of communications, text messages between Cece and Warren's attorney, emails between Cece and a legal assistant at Warren's firm, a timeline constructed from those communications that traced in precise chronological order the discovery of the jars, the inheritance filing, and the initial meeting with Dawson Hale. A text from Cece to Warren's lawyer dated 3 days after Margaret bought the building. She mentioned looking through the back rooms again today. A text to Warren a week later. Found some papers in the storage room, apparently. Old ones. She will not say what kind. A text to the lawyer's assistant 2 days after Dawson's visit. Someone named Dawson Hale came to the building today. I looked him up. He is a food brand developer. This might be bigger than we thought. A text to Warren the day after the inheritance filing. She filed something today, Dad. I think there is a real asset here. Margaret read the attachment once carefully from beginning to end. Then she printed everything, clipped the pages together, put them in a folder, and drove to Vivian's office. They are running 2 arguments. Simultaneously, Vivian said. The first is that the brand's commercial value was created by discovery and not by original registration, and that discovery occurred within a period connected to the marital proceedings. The second is an implied suggestion of non-disclosure. I did not know it existed, Margaret said. I know that. But this is not an effort to win on the merits. This is an effort to generate pressure, delay, and cost so that you accept a reduced settlement before the hearing ever reaches a substantive ruling. She looked up. How much of this information came from your daughter? Margaret looked at the timeline in the appendix. All of it, she said. The message from Neil Ashford came on a Thursday at 10:15 in the morning, while Margaret was checking the refrigerator installation with Ray. She did not recognize the number. The message read, "My name is Neil Ashford. I am Cecilia's husband. I think you should know what I have found. Call me when you can." Margaret waited until Ray had left for the day. Then she called from the back courtyard. Neil Ashford answered on the first ring. He spoke with the directness of a man who had been rehearsing what he needed to say and had decided that the most honest version was the shortest one. I went through Cecilia's phone last week. I found a sequence of messages to your ex-husband and to a lawyer at his firm. They go back over 4 months. I am going to send you screenshots while we are on the call. I want you to see them before I say anything else. The images came through one at a time. Margaret had already seen the pattern in the legal filing. But these screenshots contained something the filing had not included. The final message was from Cece to Warren's attorney. It read, "She is not thinking clearly. She is a potential liability to herself. If we do not act now, she will sign us something with Hale that we cannot undo." Margaret read the word liability. Her daughter, the girl she had carried, the child she had fed, the woman she had watched grow into someone who could walk into any room and make it feel like she belonged there. Her daughter had described her mother, the woman who had cooked every dinner and held every household together, and smiled when she was introduced as the person who kept everything running smoothly, as a liability. A risk to be managed, a problem to be contained. Margaret sat on the overturned produce crate in the courtyard. She looked up at the sky. 2 chimney swifts were cutting ellipses through the late morning air, sharp and precise, as if they had been doing this exact thing for 1,000 years and intended to continue regardless of what happened on the ground below. She did not cry, but she did not stand up either. This was the first moment in the entire story where Margaret did not know what to do next. Not because she had lost money or a house or been taken to court, But because she had just learned that her own daughter looked at her the same way Warren had always looked at her, as something to be managed, as furniture that had opinions. She sat with it. She did not call anyone. She did not reach for the phone. She sat until she knew exactly what she was feeling. It was not anger, it was sadness. The heavy, quiet kind that does not need an audience and does not go away when you name it. It just settles into you like weather. Then she stood up. Neil Ashford spoke again. "I have two daughters," he said. "When I understood what my wife had been doing, passing information about her mother in real time for months, to people who used it to try to take something away from her, I could not stay in the same room with it." "Where is she now?" Margaret asked. "At the apartment for now. I have spoken to a lawyer." Margaret thanked him. She ended the call. She forwarded every image to Vivian's email. Vivian replied in 6 minutes, "Keep all of this. Do not respond to Cecilia in writing for any reason." Margaret went back inside to check the refrigerator temperature settings. That evening, alone in the building after Ray and the electrician had gone, Margaret stood at the prep counter and looked at the 31 jars still lined up where she had placed them the day she found them. She thought about the people who wanted to take what Nell had left her. Warren, Cece, Louise, the bank. The list was long and getting longer. But there was another list. Vivian, Dawson, Reverend Blaine, Ray Fontenot, and soon a woman she had not yet called, but whose number she had kept for 11 years. A woman named Harriet Boone, who had once tried to warn her about Warren and whom Margaret had not believed. She washed her hands at the sink, dried them on a clean towel, and sat down with a notepad to write a list of kitchen equipment she needed to purchase. Not because she had forgotten what had happened that day, but because she had decided that the equipment list mattered more than the list of people trying to take what was hers. Margaret dialed Harriet Boone's number on a Tuesday morning from the back courtyard, sitting on the overturned produce crate with a cup of coffee she had not yet touched. She had kept the number saved for 11 years under a contact label she had never updated. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered. Harriet's voice was careful, the particular caution of someone who had received enough calls that began normally and ended badly that she now approached every incoming ring as a potential ambush. "It is Margaret Voss," Margaret said. "Margaret Shaw now, actually." A pause, 3 seconds, 4, then quietly, "Yes, ma'am. I am opening a diner in Baton Rouge in about 5 weeks. I need a front-of-house manager who can read a room without being told to, who can solve problems before they become larger problems, and who does not tell me what I want to hear when what I need is something different." She paused. "You were the best person I ever saw do all 3 of those things at the same time." "I am in Memphis right now," Harriet said. "Night manager at a hotel. The pay is better than that, real benefits. Your name on the staff board, not behind anyone else's." There was a silence between them that carried more weight than any sentence either of them had spoken so far. Margaret could hear Harriet breathing on the other end of the line, and she understood that what was happening in that silence was not hesitation. It was the sound of someone deciding whether the past could be set down without pretending it had never existed. "I tried to tell you," Harriet said, "before everything happened. I tried to say something." "I know. You believed him." Margaret looked at the sky above the courtyard. "I believed him for longer than I should have. That part is finished now." Another silence. Then Harriet said, "I lost my position because I tried to warn you. The agency let me go 2 weeks after your husband made a phone call." "I know I owe you more than a job," Margaret said, "but this position is what I have to offer right now." Harriet asked for 2 days to get her affairs in order. "Take 3, Margaret said. "Come when you are ready." She set the phone down on the crate beside her and drank the coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Margaret drove out to Prairieville on a Friday afternoon 3 weeks before the planned opening. The care facility was a low brick building set back from the road behind a row of crepe myrtles that had been pruned too aggressively and were just beginning to recover. She signed in at the front desk and was led down a hallway that smelled of floor wax and instant oatmeal and something floral that was trying very hard to make the other smells go away. Opal Thibodeau was 79 years old and smaller than Margaret had expected. She was seated near the window in a cushioned armchair with the careful stillness of someone who had made a gradual peace with what had once felt like surrender. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were clear. When Margaret said the name, Nell Alma Pritchard, Opal's expression changed immediately. She did not ask Margaret to repeat herself. She looked at her for several seconds with a look that was not exactly recognition. It was closer to confirmation, the arrival of something she had half expected but had stopped keeping watch for. I kept those jars because I could not bring myself to throw away something she made with her own hands, Opal said. When the building had to close, I meant to call her. I kept putting it off. By the time I found the number, people told me she was very sick, and then she was gone. I did not know what the right thing was to do with them after that. So I kept them. Margaret asked how long she had worked with her grandmother. 11 years on and off. She drove up from Natchez twice a year, the October batch and once more in spring. She never changed the recipe, not even when I asked her to consider a sweeter version for customers who did not like the heat. Opal smiled at that. She told me that sweetness without heat was not preserves, it was jam. They sat together for nearly 2 hours. Margaret told her about the building, the renovation, the inheritance filing, the brand. She told her about Dawson Hale and about the plans to produce the jelly commercially from the original formula. Opal listened to all of it without interrupting, nodding occasionally, her hands still folded. Margaret told her she wanted to establish a monthly payment from the restaurant's income once it opened. Opal frowned, preparing to decline. You kept her work intact for 17 years, Margaret said. That is the reason this restaurant exists. That is not nothing. Opal looked out the window for a long moment. The crepe myrtles outside were catching the afternoon light, their new growth almost translucent. She always said to use the small jars, Opal said finally. She said the small ones kept the jelly better if you open them. The seal held longer. Margaret wrote that down. Before she left, Opal reached out and took Margaret's hand. Her grip was light but deliberate. She would have liked you, Opal said. You are more like her than you think. Not because you cook well, because you did not ask anyone's permission to begin. Margaret drove back to Baton Rouge without turning on the radio. The silence in the car felt like company. The renovation came together in the dense, compressed way that things do when they have been planned carefully, and the people doing the work have been chosen well. The floors were finished, pale stone tile in the kitchen, reclaimed heart pine in the dining room. The kitchen passed its health inspection on the first walk through. The ventilation system was fully replaced, not patched. The front counter required a separate effort. Margaret had located a slab of reclaimed cypress wood at a salvage yard in Plaquemine, a piece that had been pulled from a warehouse built in the 1940s and had spent 80 years absorbing the particular climate of southern Louisiana into its grain. Ray Fontenot brought his father to help install it. Earl Fontenot was 78 years old. He was retired officially, but retirement for Earl meant that he no longer took paying jobs. It did not mean he had stopped working. He was shorter than his son and quieter, which was saying something because Ray was not a man given to unnecessary speech. Earl's hands were large and scarred in the particular way of someone who had spent 50 years working with wood and had the history of every mistake and every success written into his skin. He did not ask Margaret about her story. He did not ask about the divorce or the jelly or the legal filings. He asked one question: "How long do you want this counter to last?" "Longer than me," Margaret said. Earl nodded as if that were the only acceptable answer. The installation took 4 hours. Earl and Ray worked together without speaking more than a dozen words between them, communicating instead through a language of gesture and anticipation that only exists between people who have shared work for a very long time. Ray handed Earl tools before Earl reached for them. Earl checked every join with his fingers before checking with a level, trusting touch over measurement in the way that only comes with decades of practice. Margaret stood watching them and thought about Garrett, her son, 36 years old. She wondered at what point her son had learned to use his hands for signing documents instead of building things. She wondered whether that had been Warren's influence, or whether it was something she should have seen earlier and redirected. She wondered whether it mattered now. Earl stepped back from the finished counter and ran his hand along the surface the way you run your hand along something you have just brought into the world. "This kind of wood only gives in to time," he said. "It does not give in to people." Margaret heard what he said. She also heard what he meant. Harriet Boone arrived from Memphis on a Monday morning with one medium-sized suitcase and the bearing of someone who had already decided before arriving what kind of operation she intended to run. She walked through the entire floor plan twice without being prompted. She asked 7 specific questions: how many kitchen staff, whether servers would be assigned by shift or by section, which entrance deliveries would use, whether the staff restroom would be finished before the soft opening. By the end of the morning, she had drafted a server schedule and a delivery protocol that addressed 3 logistical problems Margaret had been meaning to solve, but had not yet found the time to sit down and think through. She hired staff over the following 2 weeks. She did not choose the most confident applicants. She chose the ones who listened to the full question before answering, and who, when asked what they would do if a table's order went wrong, described what they would actually do rather than what they imagined sounded good. Dawson Hale came in twice a week during the final stretch. He tasted every test batch of the pepper jelly that Margaret and the sous chef ran in the kitchen. He said almost nothing beyond technical notes. "The cloves need to come forward on this one. That batch is closer. Do not change the heat. Try the cane vinegar at a slightly lower ratio." On the 3rd batch, he said something different. "The heat level needs to come down about 15% for the broader market. Mass consumers cannot handle this intensity." Margaret stopped what she was doing. She looked at him. "My grandmother once told someone that sweetness without heat was not preserves. It was jam. I am not making jam." Dawson held her gaze. "I respect that, but if you want this brand to survive, then you have to sell it, not just cook it right." Margaret did not look away. "The brand survives because it is right, not because it is easy to swallow." The silence between them lasted long enough that the sous chef found a reason to step into the walk-in cooler. Then Dawson nodded. "Keep the heat level. Change the positioning. We tell the market this is a jelly for people who know how to eat heat, not for everyone. I will build the branding around that." "Good," Margaret said. She turned back to the stove. The disagreement had not been hostile. It had been the kind of friction that occurs between 2 people who are both serious about the same thing but have arrived at it from different directions. And the way it resolved with compromise on the approach but not on the product told Margaret something about Dawson that his 4 years of research had not. He could be argued with, he could change his mind, and he did not hold it against you afterward. The first batch of 48 jars of Magnolia River Pepper Jelly, produced from Nell Alma Pritchard's original formula, adjusted carefully for a commercial kitchen, was ready 2 weeks before opening. Margaret opened one at the prep counter with a ventilation fan running. She tasted it. It was not exactly right, but it was close enough that she could feel precisely what exactly right would be. She wrote 3 notes and gave them to the sous chef. They ran the second batch 4 days later. She opened one. "That is it," she said. The hearing was held in the 19th Judicial District Courtroom on Laurel Street in Baton Rouge 3 weeks after the petition was filed. Margaret wore a dark navy blazer she had bought at a consignment shop in New Orleans the previous weekend. It fit correctly. It looked clean. It did not require her to spend energy thinking about it on a day when her energy was needed elsewhere. Warren sat at the respondent's table with his attorney, a man named Hatcher, who had a practiced manner of suggesting urgency without raising his voice. Garrett sat beside his father. He was 36 years old and looked older. His jaw was held in a way Margaret recognized the expression he wore when he was doing something he had not fully decided was right, but had decided was necessary. He did not look at her. He looked at his phone, then at his documents, then at his phone again. Louise Pritchard Kent sat in the row behind them with her own attorney, her inheritance challenge consolidated into the same proceeding. The judge was a woman named Catherine Sinclair. She appeared to be in her late 50s and had the specific patience of someone who had presided over a great many arguments made by people who had confused confidence with correctness and had long since stopped being impressed by either. She read the petition in silence. She asked for the original documents to be presented. She reviewed the registration certificate and the rights transfer clause without speaking for several minutes. Then she looked at Hatcher and asked him to explain in plain language on what basis a premarital brand registration executed by the respondent's deceased grandmother could constitute an undisclosed marital asset. Hatcher presented 3 arguments. The first, that the commercial value of the brand had never been actualized until the respondent's post-dissolution actions had begun to bring it to market. Judge Sinclair asked whether, under that reasoning, any dormant inherited asset could be retroactively claimed as marital property if the inheriting spouse chose to develop it after a divorce. Hatcher moved to his second argument, that the respondent had constructive knowledge of the brand during the marriage, even if she had not consciously possessed it. Judge Sinclair asked what evidence existed to support that claim. Hatcher said the documents had been in a location the respondent had legally acquired. Sinclair noted that the respondent had acquired that location 22 days after the divorce was finalized. Hatcher moved to his third argument. Sinclair listened to it with the same composed attentiveness she had given the first 2. Then she turned to Louise's attorney. She examined the birth certificate. She read the transfer clause one more time. Direct lineal descendants, she said. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. The term does not include nieces. Louise stood up from her seat. "That is my family," she said, her voice rising. Sinclair looked at her over the frame of her glasses. "Family law and inheritance law do not share the same dictionary, ma'am." She set the documents down. "The premarital registration is clear. The inheritance rights are documented. There is no evidence of commingling of assets during the marriage. There is no basis for constructive knowledge. The failure to disclose an argument does not apply to an asset neither party knew existed at the time of the proceedings." She paused. "The petition is denied. The inheritance challenge is denied." Warren did not look at Margaret. He spoke briefly and quietly to Hatcher and gathered his documents with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had already begun calculating his next approach before the current one was formally over. Garrett knocked his pen off the table. It hit the stone floor with a crack that rang out clearly in the nearly empty room. Neither of them looked at her as they left. Margaret walked out to the corridor. She found a bench near the window. She sat down. She had won, but winning did not feel the way she had expected it to feel. It felt like setting down something so heavy she had been carrying it so long that she had forgotten its weight. The sudden lightness was disorienting. She sat with it for approximately 3 minutes, watching the light move across the floor of the hallway. She did not call anyone. She did not compose a message. She just sat. Then she got up, walked to the parking garage, and drove back to Beaumont Street to check on the tile installation. The first piece appeared 12 days after the hearing. It was a short item in the business section of the Baton Rouge Advocate about the dismissed petition. In the course of describing the proceeding, the reporter noted that the petitioner, Warren Shaw, was connected to a series of commercial real estate transactions that had been the subject of two separate complaints filed with the Louisiana Real Estate Commission over the preceding 18 months. The reporter had pulled the public record before writing the item. The item ran 400 words. It produced 17 follow-up inquiries to the state attorney's office within 2 weeks. A regional investigative outlet picked up the thread and began pulling documents. A law firm in New Orleans filed a civil complaint on behalf of 3 former partners of a Shaw development entity, alleging that the asset structure in several transactions had been used to obscure the beneficial interests of a related party. Garrett's name appeared in the appendices of that complaint. On multiple pages, he had signed documents. He had signed them at an age and in a professional capacity that made the signatures difficult to characterize as anything other than what they were. Marcus called Margaret on a Friday morning. His voice was tighter than she had heard it in years. "Mom, did you say anything to anyone about Dad's company? Number. Did you give your lawyer anything beyond the brand file? No. Then how did any of this start?" Margaret was in the kitchen, one hand resting on a wooden spoon. "Your father filed a petition in public court, and the paperwork attached to it included records that a reporter looked at. That is how it started." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Dad says you wanted this. Your father always interprets everything in terms of what other people want for him. I did not want anything. I wanted to open a restaurant." She set the phone down. She thought about her 2 children. Both had chosen their father's side. Not because he was right, but because his side was the side they knew. Margaret understood this. She understood that children do not always choose the side that is correct. Sometimes they choose the side that was chosen for them before they were old enough to know there were sides at all. And the journey of recognizing that was theirs to make, not hers. If someday they wanted to come back, the door, the one she had opened on the 10th morning, would still be there. Garrett did not call again. Opening morning began before the sun. Harriet was at the front door at 5:15. Hair-secured apron strings, Tate holding the delivery clipboard in both hands with the composure of someone who understood that the first hour of any morning sets the character of every hour that follows. The bread delivery came at 5:30. Produce arrived 12 minutes later. Eggs, cane vinegar, brown sugar, dried peppers, fresh peppers, buttermilk, cornmeal, fig preserves, cane syrup. Each item checked against the list. Each item put away in the order that would make the next person's job easier, not only the current one. Margaret stood at the prep counter in her work apron, flour on her forearms before 7. On the stove, the preserve pot was on low heat. Figs and hot peppers, cane sugar, apple cider vinegar, cloves mustard seed. The kitchen filled slowly with the smell that was warm and complex, in particular in the way of things that had been made from the same knowledge for a very long time. A young prep cook named Bryce, dicing bell peppers at the near end of the counter, raised his head at one point and said quietly, "There are already people outside." Harriet, without looking up from the reservation board, said, "The doors open at 11. They can wait." She said it without impatience. It was simply a fact about how the morning was proceeding. Dawson Hale arrived at 9:40 without fanfare, carrying a brown paper package under his arm. He walked directly to the kitchen counter and set the package down. "I thought this should be here from the first hour," he said. Margaret unwrapped it. Inside was a framed photograph. He had borrowed it the day before to have it reproduced and properly framed. It was a photograph Margaret had carried through 3 moves and a divorce. One of the only things she had been specific about keeping from the house on Whitmore Drive. Her grandmother, Nell Alma Pritchard, standing on the front porch of her house in Natchez on a summer afternoon, the angle of the light suggesting late July. She was holding 2 jars of pepper jelly, one in each hand, with the expression of someone who does not need approval from anyone present to know that what she has made is good. The frame was pale wood, plain glass, no nameplate, no ornamentation. Margaret picked it up and looked at it for a moment. Then she told Bryce to watch the preserve pot for 2 minutes. She carried the photograph herself to the wall beside the kitchen pass-through where every person entering the dining room would see it. Harriet handed her the hammer and the nail already prepared. No one said anything. The photograph was hung at eye level. When the doors opened at 11, the line on the sidewalk ran the full length of the building. Some were neighborhood people who had watched the renovation week by week from across the street and had been waiting for the day the sign changed. Some were people from downtown who had seen a brief post about a Baton Rouge kitchen reviving a lost Louisiana pepper jelly recipe. 2 women had driven from Natchez specifically because they had seen the name Magnolia River in a piece Dawson's team had published 3 days earlier. Margaret recognized neither of them, but one of them, seated at the table near the window, looked at the photograph on the wall for a long moment and then said to the server who came to take her order, "I knew a woman who made that a long time ago." The server said, "That is the owner's grandmother. She is the reason this place is here." By 12:30, every table was full and there was still a line on the sidewalk. Harriet moved through the room as if she had been calibrated to its specific dimensions, adjusting the temperature of the space in ways that were invisible to the guests, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what good service looked like. The orders came steadily. The kitchen ran clean and fast. The sound of it was good. Pots, oven doors, voices in short, clear phrases, the rhythm of people who knew what they were doing and why. Vivian Kincaid came in at 1 o'clock with a colleague Margaret had not met and sat at the table near the back wall. Near the end of their meal, Vivian came through to the kitchen and leaned close enough to be heard over the ventilation fan. "A federal grand jury subpoena has been issued to Coal Development. Warren lost 2 of his primary investors this morning when the news broke. Garrett is not expected to face charges directly, but the firm that had offered him a partnership has withdrawn the offer." She paused. "I thought you should hear it in person." "Thank you," Margaret said. Vivian looked through the pass-through at the full dining room for a moment. "You have a restaurant to run," she said. She went back to her table. Ray Fontenot came by at 4 in the afternoon. He did not sit down. He did not order anything. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room, at the tables at the counter his father had helped him install, at the people still eating and talking. Margaret saw him from the kitchen. She met his eyes. He nodded once. She nodded back. Then he left. By mid-afternoon, the first wave had eased. The kitchen was handling takeout orders. The servers were at the end of the bar, shoes off, talking quietly about the day. Margaret felt her phone vibrate in the pocket of her apron. She took it out. 3 missed calls from Warren's number, 1 from Cece. She looked at the screen for a moment. Then she turned the phone completely off, set it on the high shelf above the spice rack, and went back to the kitchen. By the time the last guest left that evening, the light through the front windows had shifted from gold to the particular soft blue of the Gulf South at dusk. The glasses had been collected. The floor had been swept. Harriet was finishing the end-of-day register count at the host stand, making notes about what had sold fastest and how the table layout had performed during the rush. Bryce was at the sink with his headphones in, working through the last of the pans with the easy rhythm of someone who had decided the day had been worth the effort. Dawson stood at the back door with his jacket loose over his shoulders, watching the last few people moving down Beaumont Street in the early evening air. Margaret dried her hands at the sink and stood at the kitchen threshold. From there, she could see all of it. The tables that had been full all day, the napkins still folded on the countertop, the photograph on the wall, Nell Alma Pritchard standing in the late July light with a jar in each hand, not explaining herself to anyone, the cypress counter catching the last of the evening. Harriet bent over her numbers, the servers speaking quietly, unhurried now for the first time all day. And on every table, a small jar of Magnolia River Pepper Jelly, lid open. The dark amber jelly reduced a little from the afternoon. From all the people who had taken what they wanted, used it, and left the jar back where they found it. No one in that room needed to know what had been taken from her over 22 months. No one needed to know how much of what had seemed permanent had been removed piece by piece without a single raised voice. This room had not been built from that story. It had been built from an older one, from a kitchen in Natchez in the heat of July, from a woman who cooked over a wood-fired stove and understood something about peppers and vinegar and time that she had passed down without knowing where it would eventually land, from a stack of documents lying still in a back room waiting, from a door that Margaret had opened on the exact day she had nothing left to protect. And from all of that, a room full of people at the end of a long first day carrying away a flavor they would not entirely be able to describe and a feeling they would remember longer than they expected. Margaret stood at the threshold and did not move. The evening settled around her. The sounds of the kitchen faded into the sounds of a building coming to rest. Somewhere outside, a car passed on Beaumont Street. Somewhere farther away, the river moved the way it always moved, not caring who watched, not stopping for anyone, carrying everything it touched toward the Gulf. She untied her apron. She folded it once and set it on the counter beside the photograph. She looked at her grandmother's face one more time. Then she turned off the kitchen light and walked to the front door. Harriet was waiting there, keys in hand. "Good first day," Harriet said. Margaret looked at her. "Yes," she said, "it was." They locked the door together and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The street was quiet now. The crepe myrtles at the corner were blooming early, their flowers the color of something between pink and white that did not have a proper name. The air was warm and carried the smell of the river and the faint, lingering sweetness of what had been cooked inside that building all day. Margaret stood on the sidewalk in front of the restaurant she had built with the last of what she had and looked at the sign above the door. It was not hand-painted. It was not ornate. It simply read in clean letters against a dark background, Magnolia River. She had not chosen the name because it was her grandmother's brand. She had chosen it because the Magnolia River was the kind of place you could only find if you already knew it was there. It did not announce itself. It did not explain itself. It simply was, and the people who knew about it carried it with them the way you carry the memory of a kitchen that smelled like home on a July afternoon. Margaret took one long breath of the evening air. Then she walked to her car, started the engine, and drove through the blue light of the Louisiana dusk toward a life that was finally and completely her own.